In the remotest corners of the world, where modern laws seem like distant dreams and ancient traditions reign supreme, there exists a hidden world where a young girl's life hung in the balance between rescue and tradition. When outsiders stepped in to save her, they unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would shake an entire community to its core, leading to a tribal council's decision that no one could have ever anticipated. This is the extraordinary true story of how one act of compassion became the catalyst for a conflict between two worlds. Amara was 17 years old when the world finally noticed her suffering. She lived in a remote village nestled deep within the mountains of East Africa, a place so isolated that the nearest paved road was more than 60 kilometers away. The village, home to approximately 300 people from the Maasai community, had existed in its current location for generations. Time seemed to move differently here. The days were marked not by clock hours but by the rhythm of herding cattle, the changing of seasons, and the observance of traditions that had been passed down through countless generations. Her life had been predetermined since birth, as was the custom in her community. When Amara was merely 5 years old, her father had made an arrangement with a local elder named Kostiel, a man who was already in his 50s at that time. According to the traditional practices of her tribe, Amara would become his wife once she reached the age of 16. This was not considered unusual or cruel within the context of the village. It was simply how things had always been done, the expected path that young girls followed without question. As Amara grew older, she became increasingly aware of her future. She watched her older sisters undergo the same transition, saw them leave their childhood homes to join their husbands' households. She watched her mother, who had been married off in the same manner, accept her role with a quiet dignity that never seemed to question the arrangement. Education was not a priority for girls in Amara's village. There was no school building, no teachers, no books. Knowledge came from the elders, from the stories told around evening fires, and from the practical skills learned while working alongside mothers and grandmothers. Everything changed when Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived in the village. Sarah was a humanitarian worker from North America, part of a non-governmental organization that provided basic healthcare services to remote communities. She came to the village with a team of 2 nurses and several translators, planning to spend 2 weeks providing vaccinations, treating infections, and offering basic medical education to mothers about nutrition and hygiene. When Sarah first saw Amara at the village medical clinic, something immediately alarmed her. The young girl was thin, almost skeletal, with her wrists looking fragile as bird bones. Her eyes carried a sadness that seemed far too deep for someone so young. During the examination, Sarah noticed signs of physical abuse, bruises in various stages of healing, rope marks around her wrists, and a reluctance to make eye contact that suggested trauma. Through careful and gentle questioning, with the help of her translator Kamal, who was himself from a nearby community and understood both the language and some of the cultural sensitivities, Sarah began to understand Amara's situation. The young girl hesitantly revealed that she was already living with Kostiel, despite officially still being under her father's roof. She had been sent to his household in the evenings, treated as a bride before the formal ceremonies had even taken place. When she resisted or expressed fear, she was beaten by Kostiel and his relatives. She had not eaten properly in weeks because the food given to her was insufficient, and she spent her days performing backbreaking labor. Sarah felt her heart break as she listened to this story. She had worked in difficult situations before, but hearing the raw truth from a child who was still, despite her physical appearance, very much in her youth, struck something profound within her. Amara spoke in a quiet voice that barely rose above a whisper, and, several times during the conversation, tears rolled silently down her cheeks as she described her daily existence. Sarah knew that simply leaving the village and forgetting this story was impossible. She had taken an oath to help people, and this girl was suffering. However, she also understood that rushing into action without thinking could have severe consequences. She spent the remainder of her time in the village observing the situation carefully, speaking with other girls and women, and learning more about the local social structures and power dynamics. What Sarah discovered was heartbreaking. Amara was not the only young girl in the village living in similar circumstances. There were at least 4 other girls between the ages of 14 and 17 who had been arranged to marry older men and were already living in their husbands' households while still technically children. Some had already been subjected to early pregnancy, which at their young ages posed serious health risks. The community seemed to accept this as normal, as an unchangeable part of their way of life. When Sarah returned to the capital city after her 2-week mission, she faced a difficult decision. She could not simply return to her comfortable life knowing what she had seen. She began to research legal protections for children in the country, reaching out to local organizations that worked on child protection issues. She discovered that while there were laws on the books against child marriage, enforcement in remote rural areas was virtually non-existent. The government had limited resources and little interest in pursuing cases in villages far from the centers of power and commerce. Sarah began working with a local child protection organization to develop a plan. She raised funds, gathered documentation, and built a case around Amara's situation. 6 months after her initial visit, Sarah returned to the village with a small team, armed with court orders and the support of local government officials. The rescue operation itself was surprisingly quiet. Kostiel was not present when they arrived at his compound. The team, accompanied by 2 police officers who had driven out from the nearest town, simply retrieved Amara and took her to a safe house operated by the child protection organization in the nearest city. Amara was frightened and confused, but she was also hopeful. For the first time in her life, someone had treated her as a person worthy of protection, worthy of a different future. The organization placed Amara in a transitional home with several other girls who had been rescued from similar situations. She received medical treatment, counseling, and, most importantly, she was enrolled in a school. For the first time, at the age of 17, Amara began to learn to read and write. She was far behind her age peers, but she was determined. She devoured every lesson, every book, as if she was making up for lost time. Sarah maintained close contact with Amara during this period. The young woman blossomed under care and education. Her physical health improved dramatically. Her face, which had once carried only sadness, began to show glimpses of laughter and genuine joy. Within months, she was reading at a basic level, solving simple math problems, and talking about dreams she had never allowed herself to imagine before. She talked about becoming a teacher, about helping other girls in her community escape similar fates. But, back in the village, everything was not calm. When Kostiel returned to discover that his bride had been taken away by the authorities, he was enraged. More importantly, the elders of the community saw this as an unprecedented insult. A girl who had been promised and given to a husband had been removed by outsiders. This was not simply a legal matter or a moral question, from their perspective. It was a violation of tribal authority, a challenge to their customs, and a humiliation of their elder, Kostiel. The village elders called a meeting, the first major council gathering in months. Men sat in concentric circles under the acacia trees, their voices rising and falling as they debated what had happened and what should be done about it. Some were angry at the government intrusion. Others, particularly the younger men and a few progressive-minded elders, seemed troubled but uncertain. The women, as was customary, listened from a distance without speaking. News of the council meeting eventually reached Sarah and Amara. What happened next would shock everyone involved and force a confrontation between 2 completely different visions of justice, rights, and the future. The village elders made an unprecedented decision. They would formally reach out to the authorities and to Sarah herself. They wanted to meet, to negotiate, to discuss what had happened. This was extraordinary because the community rarely engaged with outside authorities. This was a signal that something significant was happening, that the traditional structures were being forced to acknowledge and respond to forces beyond their control. Sarah received a message through her organization's local contacts that the elders wanted to meet with her and Amara. The implications were unclear, but the message was urgent. Some of Sarah's colleagues advised caution, warning her that the elders might be planning something vindictive or that it could be dangerous to engage with the community again. Others suggested that this was an opportunity for dialogue and, perhaps, reconciliation. Sarah made the decision to go, and, crucially, she insisted that Amara be involved in the decision of whether to participate. This was a critical moment. Amara, despite her fear, wanted to return to the village. She wanted to see her family, and she wanted to face the men who had caused her so much suffering. She wanted them to understand what they had done to her, and, perhaps, she secretly hoped, she wanted them to change. On a hot afternoon, 6 months after her rescue, Amara traveled back to her village for the first time. Sarah accompanied her, along with Kamau the translator and a local government social worker. The truck drove up the winding mountain path and into the village, and, immediately, people stopped what they were doing to watch. Children ran alongside the vehicle. Women whispered to each other. The men began to gather. The elders were waiting in the shade, sitting on traditional stools arranged in a circle. Castiel stood nearby, his face dark with anger and humiliation. As Amara stepped out of the vehicle, a collective tension seemed to settle over the gathering. She stood tall, noticeably healthier and more confident than when she had left. She was wearing simple clothes, but she carried herself with a dignity that had not been visible before. Chief Mwangi, the oldest and most respected elder, gestured for Amara to sit. His voice, when he spoke, was grave and measured. He said that the council had deliberated long and hard about what had occurred. They understood that the government would not reverse the removal of the girl. They understood that the law, strange as it seemed to them, had intervened in their affairs. But what they wanted to discuss, what they had brought everyone together to address, was something far more complex and far more unexpected than anyone had anticipated. As the council meeting began formally, Chief Mwangi's words carried the weight of someone who had led his people through many challenges. He explained that the village had spent months wrestling with new realities that were forcing their traditional world to confront uncomfortable truths. While they had initially responded with anger to what they perceived as outside interference, a significant shift had been occurring quietly among some of the community members. The chief revealed that several women in the village, including Amara's own mother, had begun speaking privately about their own experiences with early marriage and the impact it had on their lives and health. 3 of the younger men had attended a government workshop in a nearby town about child protection laws. Most surprisingly, Castiel himself, though still maintaining his pride and dignity, had been forced to acknowledge certain realities through conversations with other elders who had begun questioning their customs in light of what they were learning about the wider world. However, the council was not there to simply apologize or concede defeat to outside pressure. That would have been a loss of face that the community could not accept. Instead, they were proposing something far more nuanced and complex. The elders had made a collective decision that they wished to bring to the government and, to Sarah, they wanted to establish a new path forward that respected both the need to protect children and their desire to maintain their cultural identity and authority within their own community. Chief Mwangi outlined their proposal. First, they would formally revoke all current child betrothals in the village, acknowledging that the practice had caused suffering and that there were compelling reasons rooted in health, well-being, and genuine protection to end it. This was a monumental concession because it meant that the agreements their ancestors had made, the promises given years or even decades ago, would be rendered void. For men like Castiel, it meant accepting the loss of the status and the bride price that had already been paid. To address this, the second part of their proposal involved community compensation. The families who had already paid bride price for girls who would not now be married would receive compensation from a communal fund. The village would require all families to contribute to this fund based on their means, understanding that this was the cost of changing their practices. It was a form of collective accountability and cost-sharing that reflected their communal values. The third element of their proposal was the most groundbreaking. The elders wanted to work with the government to establish a school in the village. Not just any school, but one specifically focused on girls' education. They recognized that if they were to end child marriage, they needed to provide an alternative path for young girls, one that gave them value and purpose within the community while preparing them for a future that could include choices beyond marriage. Furthermore, the council proposed establishing a group of women elders who would have formal authority in decisions affecting the village's young people. This acknowledged that women's perspectives had been largely absent from leadership, and that this absence had contributed to harmful practices being accepted without sufficient questioning. Sarah listened carefully as all of this was explained. She was shocked. She had prepared for hostility, for arguments, perhaps even for veiled threats. Instead, she was hearing a community acknowledge problems and propose real solutions. She was careful not to show too much emotion, understanding that this moment required respect for the elders' process and dignity. Amara sat silently throughout most of the presentation. When Chief Mwangi finished speaking, the elders turned their attention to her, waiting for her response. The silence stretched long enough to become almost uncomfortable. Finally, Amara spoke, and her voice, though still quiet, carried a clarity that seemed to surprise everyone present. She said that she appreciated what the elders were proposing, but she wanted to understand something. She asked whether these commitments would actually be followed through, or if they were being made simply because outsiders were present. She asked if the girls who were born in the future would be protected, or if these promises would fade once the government attention moved away from the village. She asked what would happen to her and the other girls who had already suffered, whether their trauma would be acknowledged or simply forgotten. These questions, coming from a young girl who was supposed to be silent and obedient, created a notable stir. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably. But Chief Mwangi nodded slowly, and, to everyone's surprise, he seemed to appreciate the directness of the questions. The chief responded that these were difficult questions that the council had also asked itself. He acknowledged that habits and traditions did not change overnight, and that commitment to change required constant vigilance. He proposed something unprecedented. Amara herself would be invited to help oversee the changes, working with the newly established women elders to ensure that the promises made were actually being kept. She would be given an official status as an advisor to the council on matters concerning young people. Furthermore, the council offered Amara something else. They offered to sponsor her education completely, paying for not only her school fees but also providing her with accommodation if she chose to continue her studies beyond what the new village school could offer. They acknowledged that they had failed to protect her and that they could not undo the harm that had been done, but they could offer her support to build the future she deserved. The council also addressed the compensation matter directly with Kostiel. The elders had met with him beforehand and helped him understand that while the loss of his bride price represented a financial and social loss, continuing to be associated with the harmful practice would ultimately diminish his status far more than accepting change would. They had worked out an arrangement where Kostiel would contribute to the community fund and would receive partial compensation for the bride price already paid, not as a reward but as a mechanism to allow him to accept the change without losing complete face. The day of the council meeting turned into something unexpected. As word spread through the village about what was being decided, people began gathering. Women, who would normally have stayed hidden during such proceedings, came forward. Several older women spoke about their own experiences, about the health complications of early marriage, about the daughters and granddaughters they hoped would have different lives. A particularly moving moment came when Amara's own mother stood up, something she had never done before in any council meeting. She spoke about the pain of watching her daughter suffer, about knowing it was happening but feeling powerless to stop it because custom and her own position in society had not given her the voice or authority to intervene. She spoke about the relief she had felt when Amara was taken to safety, and about her hope that her younger daughters would never face the same fate. Kostiel's response was telling. Rather than continuing to rage against the decision, he made a surprising statement. He said that he had been thinking deeply about the situation and about his role in it. He had never intended to hurt the girl, he insisted, but he acknowledged that his actions had caused harm. He stated that he would accept the council's decision and would support the proposal to improve girls' education in the village. More than that, he pledged to donate one of his fields to be used as a community resource for the new school. This gesture, while perhaps motivated partly by a desire to restore his reputation, represented a significant acknowledgement. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. A man who had been benefiting directly from the child marriage custom was now willing to sacrifice his own property to end that custom. Over the following weeks, Sarah stayed in close contact with the village as the proposals began to be implemented. She helped connect the community with government education specialists and NGO resources. The Women Elders Group held its first meeting, with 6 respected women taking on formal roles in community decision-making for the first time in the village's recent history. Amara made a choice that surprised some but felt right to her. She decided to live part-time in the village and part-time in the city, commuting between the two worlds. In the city, she continued her formal education, spending 4 days a week in school. The other 3 days, she spent in the village, working with the new school committee, meeting with the women elders, and sharing her experiences with other young girls. This arrangement was possible because Sarah's organization agreed to provide the transportation costs and a small stipend to cover expenses. It was an unconventional solution that required Amara to navigate between two very different worlds, but it allowed her to maintain her education while also being present to ensure that the changes promised in the village were actually happening. The transition was not always easy. Amara experienced moments of profound sadness when she returned to the village and encountered places where she had suffered, people who had been complicit in her abuse, and the complex mixture of familiar love and familiar pain that characterized her relationship with her community. Yet she also experienced moments of unexpected joy and hope when she saw change beginning to manifest in tangible ways. 3 months after the council meeting, the foundation was laid for the new school building. It was constructed on the land that Kostiel had donated, a location that held its own symbolic power. The elder who had caused her such harm had inadvertently created the space where her younger sisters and other girls from the village would gain the tools to shape their own futures. Amara attended the school inauguration ceremony, and, though she had been released from the responsibility of being on public display, she was invited to speak. She kept her remarks brief, addressing the young girls who would be the first students. She told them that education was not just about learning to read and write, though those skills were important. Education was about understanding that they had choices, that their voices mattered, and that their futures did not have to be determined entirely by tradition or by the decisions of others. As the children looked up at this young woman who had survived abuse and emerged stronger, many of them probably understood, at some level, that they were witnessing something significant. Amara represented a bridge between the old world and a new possibility. What nobody present at that ceremony fully understood yet was that the story was far from over, and that the shocks and surprises were not finished. The changes that had been set in motion would create ripple effects that would extend far beyond what the council had anticipated, forcing everyone involved to confront difficult questions about progress, tradition, justice, and the true meaning of cultural respect. 1 year after Amara's rescue, everything appeared to be progressing according to the new vision that the village had committed to. The school was thriving with over 60 girls enrolled, ranging from young children beginning their first formal education to teenagers like Amara who were determined to make up for lost years. The curriculum included not only basic academics but also practical skills like financial literacy and health education. The women elders were meeting regularly and beginning to have real influence on community decisions. Amara was now 18, and she had grown into someone quite different from the frightened girl who had lived with Kostiel. She was fluent in reading and writing, spoke with confidence, and had become a trusted advisor to her community. She remained in school, but she had also begun mentoring younger girls, particularly those who had been rescued from situations similar to hers or who were at risk of being forced into early marriages. It was during a routine women's elders meeting that the crisis emerged. The meeting was being held in the new school building, and present were the 6 women elders, Sarah, Amara, and Kamal who was translating. The topic was supposed to be the implementation of new health education materials in the school curriculum, but, as the meeting was beginning, Chief Mwangi arrived with 2 other senior male elders. This was unusual because men typically did not attend women's council meetings. The chief looked troubled, his weathered face showing more lines than Amara remembered. He said that the Council of Male Elders had called an emergency meeting the night before, and they had reached a decision that needed to be communicated to the women elders and to Sarah. What he was about to say would shock everyone present. The chief explained that another girl from the village, a child named Nalini who was only 14 years old, had been abducted by a neighboring village. The abduction was not a random crime but was, according to their information, part of a broader conflict between the two communities that had been brewing for months. The neighboring village believed that the original village had violated their rights by interfering with what they considered to be their own internal cultural practices. They were now taking what they believed was appropriate retribution by taking one of their neighbors' daughters. The chief further explained that the neighboring village had sent a message proposing a trade. They would return Nalini unharmed on one condition: the original village would send back a daughter of their own to marry a young man in the neighboring village. This was a girl whom the neighboring village had identified from the original village. The girl they had chosen was Amara herself. The room fell into a stunned silence. Sarah's face went pale. The women elders looked at each other, confusion and horror written across their features. Amara felt her body go numb, as if she was outside herself, hearing about something happening to someone else. The chief continued, explaining that the Council of Male Elders was deeply troubled by this situation. They wanted to be clear that they did not support the abduction, and they were negotiating with the authorities to attempt a rescue of Nalini. However, they were also being practical about the reality they faced. The neighboring community was powerful, had connections to armed men who protected their village, and had demonstrated that they were willing to use violence to make their point. The council was now facing an agonizing dilemma. If they pursued Nalini's rescue through official channels, the neighboring village had indicated they would hurt the girl. If they refused the proposed exchange, the neighboring village would likely escalate the conflict, potentially leading to armed violence that could destabilize the entire region and result in more people being harmed. However, the chief said, they were not proposing to simply accept this demand. They had called a meeting to discuss it with the women elders and with Sarah and Amara specifically because they believed the decision could not be made without full participation and understanding from everyone affected. Sarah immediately spoke up, her initial shock giving way to a sharp clarity. She said that offering Amara as an exchange would be trading one girl's suffering for another's temporary safety, and it was unacceptable. She said that her organization would help pursue legal channels, would support a rescue operation, and would do everything in their power to protect both girls. But, before she could continue, Amara spoke. Her voice was steady, but there was an undertone of deep emotion. She said that she wanted to understand the full situation first. She asked the chief to explain what the neighboring village's actual grievances were, because she sensed that this was not simply about them interfering with cultural practices but something deeper. Chief Mwangi nodded, respecting the question. He explained that the neighboring village had their own practices regarding marriage and family alliances, and they believed that by ending child marriage in the original village, they had lost potential economic and political advantages that would have come from future marriages between the two communities. Additionally, some of their young men were angry that girls from the neighboring village who were married into the original village community were being encouraged to question their roles and to seek education. The women elders and the new school were being seen as a threat to the stability of social structures across a wider region. In other words, the neighboring village was not randomly hostile. They were threatened by the changes that Amara's village was making, and they saw Amara specifically as emblematic of those threatening changes. Her rescue had been a catalyst, and now she was being seen as the enemy. One of the older women elders, Mama Ruth, who had been silent until this point, finally spoke. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through many changes and challenges. She said that the men of the council were facing an impossible choice, and she understood why they had brought this to the women elders and to Amara. She said that in the past, when villages faced such conflicts, they would have simply sacrificed one daughter to protect another and to preserve peace. But they were not the past anymore. They had committed to protecting their children, and protecting them meant not just from individual men like Kostiel but from these larger systems that treated girls as trading commodities. Mama Ruth proposed that they work backwards from the goal. The goal was to protect both Nalini and Amara. To achieve this, they needed to address the real issue, which was the neighboring village's fear and anger about the changes happening. She suggested that a delegation should go to the neighboring village not with an offer of a girl but with an invitation to dialogue and cooperation. Perhaps the neighboring village could also benefit from education programs and from rethinking practices that harmed their own young people. This proposal was met with skeptical looks from some of the men elders, but it was also met with thoughtful consideration. Sarah immediately offered to coordinate with government and NGO contacts to fund a peacebuilding and education initiative that could involve both villages, framing it not as change being imposed by outsiders but as both communities making informed choices about their futures. The chief seemed to be contemplating this, but then, a young elder named Tariq, who was probably in his early 40s and had shown progressive tendencies before, spoke up. He said that while he appreciated Mama Ruth's vision, the reality was that the neighboring village would not respond to an education program. They would see it as weakness. They had made a demand, and, in their framework, if the original village did not meet that demand, they would interpret it as a rejection and a reason to escalate.
Tarek proposed something more direct.
He said that they should call the neighboring villages bluff. They should make a clear, public statement that they would not exchange Amara or any other girl, and, simultaneously they should organize a coordinated rescue operation with government support to retrieve Nalini by force if necessary. They should make it clear that this village would no longer allow its daughters to be treated as bargaining chips under any circumstances.
This triggered intense debate among the elders.
Some agreed with Tarek that showing strength was the only language the neighboring village would understand. Others worried about the violence that might result from such a confrontation. Still others, including Mama Ruth, continued to advocate for dialogue and understanding as a longer-term solution, even if it didn't immediately solve the crisis.
Throughout this debate, Amara was silent, watching and listening.
When finally, asked directly for her thoughts, she said something that seemed to cut through the complexity. She said that she understood all of the arguments being made, and they were all rooted in legitimate concerns. But she wanted to make her own position clear. She said that she would not consent to being exchanged for Nalini under any circumstances, not because she was brave or strong but because doing so would betray everything that she had learned in the past year about her own worth as a human being. She said that Nalini was a 14-year-old child who deserved protection and safety, and that protection should not come at the cost of another girl's freedom. Furthermore, she said that the neighboring village needed to understand that girls were not objects to be traded or used to settle disputes. That was the fundamental belief that needed to change if anything was going to get better. Most significantly, Amara said that she wanted to be involved in whatever solution was chosen, not as a victim being protected but as an active participant in addressing this crisis. She said that if they were going to do a rescue operation, she wanted to be part of the planning. If they were going to pursue dialogue, she wanted to be involved in those conversations.
What Amara was proposing was radical.
She was essentially saying that she did not want to be treated as a child who needed to be protected from decisions but as a young woman with a voice and agency in determining her own future and the future of her community. This was precisely the kind of thinking that the neighboring village was threatened by, and, ironically, it was exactly what Amara's own community had been learning to support through the past year's changes. The council agreed to Amara's participation. Over the following weeks, a strategy was developed that combined elements of both approaches. A government rescue team prepared to extract Nalini through force if necessary, but, before executing that operation, a delegation including Amara, Sarah, Chief Mwangi, and 2 other male elders would travel to the neighboring village to attempt negotiation. The goal of the negotiation was not to trade Amara but to help the neighboring village's leadership understand what was happening in the original village and to invite them to participate in a broader regional effort to improve girls' education and economic opportunity.
Sarah's organization would fund education programs in both villages. Government officials would attend to discuss support for development initiatives.
What happened in those negotiations was not a complete triumph or a perfect resolution, because real conflicts between communities rarely have such clean outcomes. However, it was a significant shift. The neighboring village's leaders, when they understood the scope of what was being offered and when they saw that the original village was not backing down from its commitment to its daughter's safety, agreed to release Nalini unharmed. More surprisingly, after the initial negotiations, some of the younger women from the neighboring village expressed interest in attending the education programs that were being set up. Within months, girls from both villages were attending classes together, creating a practical demonstration of the possibility of cooperation and change. Amara remained in her village, continuing her education and her work with the women elders. She eventually became one of the first girls from the village to complete secondary education and was accepted into a teacher training program. Her story became known to NGOs and government officials working on girls' education and child protection throughout the region. But, perhaps the most significant outcome was less visible and less celebrated. It was the shift in consciousness that had occurred within the original village and that was beginning to spread to neighboring communities. The children who attended the new school, both boys and girls, were growing up with a different understanding of what was possible, what was acceptable, and what their responsibilities were to each other. Years later, when Amara was in her 20s and working as a teacher, she would often reflect on the journey that had brought her to that point. She understood that her rescue had not been an ending but a beginning. The true work of change, she came to believe, was not the single dramatic act of removing a girl from an abusive situation. That was necessary and important, but it was only the first step. The real work was in changing the beliefs, values, and structures that had allowed that abuse to happen in the first place. She also understood that the tribal chiefs' decision to fundamentally alter their practices had not come easily or without cost. Those decisions had required them to let go of power, to acknowledge that their traditional ways were causing harm, and to accept outside influence and new ideas. That kind of change was profoundly difficult, and the fact that they had chosen it, even imperfectly, was itself a form of courage. The final shocking decision that the tribal chiefs had made was not the one that Amara or Sarah had expected when they returned to the village. It was not a decision made under pressure or coercion, but one made through a slow process of questioning and dialogue. It was the decision that the future of their community depended not on preserving every aspect of their traditions unchanged but on having the wisdom to distinguish between cultural practices that brought meaning and community cohesion and practices that caused suffering to the most vulnerable members of their society. By taking Amara's voice seriously, by inviting her into the rooms where decisions were made, by allowing her to shape the future, the tribal chiefs had made the most radical decision of all. They had acknowledged that their daughters' futures were not theirs alone to determine.